This is not the first time that India, its leaders, its culture, its democracy, has been misrepresented by a foreign journalist or someone sitting thousands of miles away who thinks they understand this country better than a billion people who actually live here. It has happened before. It will happen again. But this time they really truly crossed a line. What we are about to look at is not just one incident. It is two incidents, back to back, that took place while Prime Minister Narendra Modi was on an official diplomatic visit to Norway. A visit that was historic, the first time an Indian Prime Minister had set foot on Norwegian soil in over 40 years. 40 years. And this is how India gets greeted. Before anything else, just have a look at this clip.
Okay.
Right now. Like
No,
now.
please. We have a question there.
But I might also have follow-up questions, so it would be
Please.
better if you answer
We
right
have
away and then
question.
I can follow up.
Now, many people have also seen the Modi clip that went viral. That will absolutely be covered. But the more important moment, the one that deserves the most attention, is this press conference right here. Let's get into it. First, in the context, because it matters enormously. Prime Minister Modi was on a 5-nation diplomatic tour of Europe. UAE, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Italy. Norway was the 4th stop, and this was no routine visit. It was the first time an Indian Prime Minister had visited Norway in over 40 years. A historic bilateral engagement. A green strategic partnership was signed between the two nations. A Nordic summit took place, and Prime Minister Modi was awarded Norway's highest civilian honor, the Grand Cross of the Royal Norwegian Order of Merit, by King Harald V himself. That brings Modi's total count of international honors from foreign nations to 32. Serious, substantive diplomacy. India arrived in complete good faith. Now, even after the day's events concluded, the Indian embassy in Oslo did something that actually reflects real confidence. They arranged a press conference at the Radisson Blu Hotel, and they invited the Norwegian press to attend. The message was clear. Come, ask your questions. India is not hiding. India is not running. Come and ask. And so a Norwegian journalist walked into that room, and she asked MEA Secretary Sibi George, the senior diplomat responsible for coordinating the entire Norway visit, 3 questions. Now, before covering what he said, these questions need to be heard, because the questions themselves tell you everything about what kind of moment this was. She asked, "Why should we trust you? Can you promise that you will try to stop the human rights violations that go on in your country? Will the Prime Minister start taking critical questions from the Indian press at some point in the future?" And then she added, and this part is remarkable, she said, "If possible, I would like you to answer straight away." She wanted him to answer straight away. Can you promise to stop human rights violations? Answer straight away, please. That is not a journalistic question. That is a prosecution. That is someone who has already decided the verdict and is simply asking the defendant to confirm it on camera. That is the audacity of this moment, right there, in those 3 questions. And honestly, if it had been Jaishankar sitting in that room, anyone who has followed his career knows exactly the kind of reply that journalists would have received. Sharp, calm, devastatingly precise. Jaishankar has made an art form out of putting Western critics in their place, with class, with facts, and without raising his voice once. We all know those moments, and we will actually be covering what Minister Jaishankar has been up to very recently, because he has been busy, and it is worth your attention. That comes later in this video. But for now, Sibi George was in that room, and as it turns out, he was no less. While Sibi George was in the middle of giving his answer, a detailed, substantive, historically grounded answer, she interrupted him. Not once, multiple times. She talked over him. She pushed him to answer differently, faster, on her terms. And think about what that takes. This is a press conference that India organized, a press conference that India invited her to attend. The diplomat is mid-sentence answering her question, and she cuts him off. Here is the clip.
You ask me question, let me answer it. Let me answer the question. Please don't interrupt me. Please don't interrupt me. You ask me a question. Please This is my press conference. You ask why should a country trust India? Why should a country trust India? Why should a country trust India? Let me answer that question.
Now, anyone in that position would have gotten angry. Any person, any diplomat, any professional with less composure would have snapped, would have said something they regretted on camera. Sibi George did none of that. He was stern. He was firm. He drew the line clearly and calmly. Please don't interrupt me. This is my press conference. And then he continued his answer. That is extraordinary composure from a man who has spent 3 decades in some of the world's most difficult diplomatic postings. Tehran, Islamabad, rooms far more dangerous than a hotel in Oslo. And what he said after that, that is what needs to be heard properly, because his response was not diplomatic deflection or PR talking points. It was a genuine, intelligent, historically rich defense of India, and it deserves to be taken seriously and shared far more widely than it has been. So here is a walkthrough of what he said, and why every single point he made was not only accurate, but deeply, deeply important. He turned the question back on itself. He asked, why should the world trust India? And then he answered it. His first point was COVID. When the entire world was suffering, when wealthy nations were scrambling to hoard vaccines for themselves, India did not retreat. India supplied vaccines to more than 100 countries. India supplied medicines to 150 countries. At a time when India itself was facing one of the most difficult health crises in its modern history, India still looked outward. India still extended a helping hand to the world. Now consider that number. 150 countries received medicines from India during COVID. How many countries of 5 million people? How many countries that hold the #1 position on press freedom rankings sent medicines to 150 nations during a global pandemic? And he was absolutely right when he said, that is what builds trust, not promises made at hotel press conferences, actions taken when the world was desperate and watching. Then he moved to the G20. In 2023, the world was fractured. The Russia-Ukraine conflict had shattered international consensus. Before the 2023 G20 summit, there could be no joint declaration. After the 2024 G20 summit, there could be no joint declaration. But when India organized and chaired the G20 in 2023, a divided world came together. The Delhi Declaration was adopted unanimously. How? Because India does not belong to any bloc. India carries no one else's agenda. Decades of genuinely independent foreign policy mean that countries trust India to be an honest broker in ways they simply cannot trust others. And there was something else he mentioned, something particularly powerful. Before the 2023 G20, India organized the Voice of Global South Summit. 3 times. 125 countries participated because India looked at the G20 table and said, the voices of the developing world are not being heard here. The Global South has challenges and aspirations that the wealthy nations are ignoring. India used its G20 presidency not just to advance its own interests, but to bring the entire developing world into that conversation. And for the first time in the history of the G20, the African Union was made a permanent member. First time, because India pushed for it. Now, someone sitting in Oslo, reading a report from a Paris NGO, does any of this appear in that report? Is any of this being asked about? Or is she simply walking in with a conclusion and asking for a confession? Because that is the difference between journalism and performance. And what happened in that room was a performance. And then George said something that cut to the absolute heart of this entire debate. He talked about India not as a country born in 1947, but as a continuous civilization, 5,000 years old, unbroken, living. He said, look around. The numbers on phones originated in India. 0 originated in India. Chess originated in India. Yoga, which the entire world has adopted, originated in India. India had epics, literature, and philosophy when much of the world was still finding its footing. And why does this matter in a conversation about human rights and trust? Because it exposes the fundamental audacity of the framing. A nation with a few hundred years of recorded modern democratic history is asking a civilization of 5,000 years to prove itself. A nation that, within living memory, was part of a colonial system that stripped other nations of their resources, their languages, their dignity, their futures, is asking India to promise to do better. Norway is a fine country. This is not an attack on Norway, but the assumption that Norway sits in moral judgment over India. That is a colonial hangover dressed in modern language, and it needs to be called out, respectfully, firmly, exactly the way Sibi George called it out. He also said something else that deserves to be put on a billboard. He said India is 1/6 of the total population of the world, but India is not 1/6 of the problems of the world. 1/6 of humanity lives in India. If India were as dysfunctional as NGO reports suggest, if India were as oppressive as press freedom rankings imply, 1/6 of the world's population would be living in chaos. And they are not. Hundreds of millions of Indians have been lifted out of poverty in recent decades. India runs the world's largest democratic elections. Power transfers peacefully. India's Supreme Court rules against the government regularly. India's media, whatever its challenges, is enormous, diverse, and relentlessly loud. That line alone should have ended the conversation. He then went to the Indian Constitution, because the journalist had walked in essentially suggesting India has no accountability, no rights framework, no mechanisms to protect its citizens. And George answered that directly. He quoted the preamble: justice, social, economic, political, liberty of thought and expression, equality of status and opportunity, dignity of the individual, all guaranteed, all enforceable in court. He said, every human being in India has a fundamental right, a right to go to court if that right is violated. Every single one. And then came the line that the entire country has been repeating ever since. He said, there are at least 200 TV channels in Delhi alone, in English, in Hindi, in multiple languages, breaking news every hour of every day. People have no understanding of the scale of India. And then, with full composure, he said, people read 1 or 2 news reports published by some godforsaken, ignorant NGOs, and then come and ask questions. He said that on camera in Oslo, and he was right, because that is exactly what has been happening. A Paris-based NGO publishes an index. That index gets quoted everywhere. That index becomes the definitive word on India's democracy. Nobody questions the methodology. Nobody questions the funding. Nobody questions the political framework of the organization producing it. They just quote the number. India is 157, and walk into a room and ask India to confess. Sibi George said, not today, not in this room, and nobody in that room was prepared for the scale he was about to describe. India has nearly 900 privately owned television channels. Around 350 to 450 of those are dedicated entirely to news, broadcasting around the clock every single day. India has over 140,000 registered newspapers and periodicals, published in 22 official languages and across 189 languages and dialects. Over 20,000 daily newspapers, their combined daily circulation, more than 390 million copies, every day. Norway, which holds the #1 spot on the Press Freedom Index for the 10th consecutive year, has a population of 5 million, a handful of major newspapers, a public broadcaster. The image being painted of India as a country where the press is controlled, where information is suppressed, where citizens have no access to independent voices. That image does not survive contact with those numbers, not even close. He ended his answer with something quintessentially Indian, in the best possible way. He spoke about India's fundamental foreign policy ethos, and he summed it up in a Sanskrit phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family, not a slogan, not a marketing line. A principle from ancient Indian scripture, thousands of years old, that India used as the central theme of its G20 presidency in 2023. A principle that says, every human being on this planet belongs to one family, every nation, every people, every culture. And he said, this is what guides India. This is what has always guided India. India does not dominate. India does not colonize. India does not tell other nations how to live. India believes in common global good. India supplies some of the largest contingents of peacekeepers to the United Nations. India bridges divides. India brought the global south to the table. India is a country that, for 5,000 years, has welcomed everyone who came to its shores. He said, India is diverse because India has tolerance. India has many religions, many ethnicities, many languages. Not by accident, but because when others persecuted people, India welcomed them. When others went for ethnic cleansing, India went for coexistence. That is who India is. That is why the world trusts India, not because of a promise made at a press conference in Oslo, because of 5,000 years of showing up for humanity. And that was his answer to, why should we trust you? Extraordinary, composed, historically grounded, and completely undeniably accurate. Now that the press conference has been covered in full, here is the incident that most people saw first, the clip that went viral. Prime Minister Modi walking away. Here is what happened. Let us be very clear about what is happening in that clip. Prime Minister Modi and Norwegian PM Jonas Gahr Støre had just concluded a joint press briefing. Both leaders gave their statements. That was the format. Joint statements, not a press conference, not an open Q&A statements. This is completely standard diplomatic protocol at every bilateral meeting at this level in every country in the world. Leaders speak, they leave. This is not unusual. This is not suspicious. This is diplomacy as it has been practiced for decades. After the statements concluded, the leaders began to leave the room, and the journalists shouted across the room, at the Prime Minister of 1.4 billion people, a man who had just been awarded Norway's highest civilian honor by the king, a man concluding a full day of historic bilateral diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi, why don't you take some questions from the freest press in the world? Prime Minister Modi continued walking and did not respond. Now here is something that gets missed in almost every discussion of this clip. Norwegian PM Støre, whom everyone applauded for staying back to talk to journalists, also did not take questions at the joint briefing. The format was always statements only. Støre's choice to informally chat with reporters afterward was his own decision. But the joint event itself was never a press conference. Modi walked out of a statements-only event at its scheduled conclusion, exactly as every head of state does at every comparable event around the world. Is there a fair conversation to have about whether Modi should hold more open press conferences with independent journalists? Yes. That is a real and valid debate. He has not conducted traditional open press conferences in years. That is worth discussing. In India, through Indian media, pushed by Indian journalists. But that is a completely separate conversation from a journalist shouting across a diplomatic room in Oslo. Those two things should not be mixed together. And the framing that Modi was running or panicking, that framing is built on a false premise. The audacity was not in his silence. The audacity was in the shout. So earlier it was mentioned that Jaishankar has been busy. Here is that update. Just a few days before the Norway incident happened, on May 14th, Dr. S. Jaishankar was in New Delhi at Bharat Mandapam, hosting one of the biggest diplomatic gatherings India has seen in recent times, the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting. And India was not just attending this meeting, India was running it. India holds the BRICS chair this year. Now, for those who do not follow this closely, BRICS is one of the most powerful groupings of nations outside the Western world. And the room in New Delhi that day had some very heavy names in it. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was there. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was there. Ministers from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and dozens of other nations, all sitting at a table that India had set. And Jaishankar stood up and said exactly what needed to be said. He said the world right now is going through a very difficult and uncertain time. Conflicts everywhere. Trade being disrupted, energy prices going up, shipping routes under threat. The global economy is fragile, and the world needs leaders who are honest about that. Then he said something that was directed squarely at the Western powers, without naming them directly. He said that when powerful countries impose sanctions on smaller and developing nations to get their way, that is unjustifiable. Those were his exact words, unjustifiable, because those sanctions do not hurt the powerful, they hurt the poor, they hurt developing countries the most, and they are not diplomacy, they are pressure tactics, and pressure cannot replace real dialogue. He also spoke about the West Asia crisis, the conflict that has been threatening oil supplies and shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. He said this is not just a problem for that region. This affects every country in the world, every economy, and it needs serious international attention. Not ignoring, not managing from a distance. He pushed for reform of the United Nations Security Council. He said plainly, the UN Security Council as it currently exists does not represent the world as it actually is today. More countries need a permanent seat at that table. Without that, the UN loses credibility. The world has changed. The institutions need to catch up. And on terrorism, something India has lived with, fought against, and lost lives to, he was completely clear. No softness, no diplomatic language. Cross-border terrorism is a violation of international relations. Zero tolerance must be the standard. Not for some countries, not when it is convenient. For everyone, always. Now think about what this picture looks like. While a Norwegian journalist was in Oslo asking India's diplomat to promise to fix human rights violations, India's external affairs minister was in New Delhi, chairing a room full of the world's most powerful foreign ministers, setting the agenda for the global south, and telling the most powerful nations on earth that their days of making the rules for everyone else are over. Same country, same week, two very different rooms. One very clear message. India does not need anyone's permission. India does not wait for anyone's approval. India shows up at every table, in every room, at every level, and speaks for itself. That is the connection between Sibi George in Oslo and Jaishankar in New Delhi. Different men, different settings, but the same confidence, the same clarity, the same India. And honestly, that is something worth stopping and appreciating. And that brings everything together. What happened in Oslo was a provocation. A journalist walked into a room that India had opened in good faith, asked a diplomat to promise to fix human rights violations on the spot, interrupted him mid-sentence, and expected him to fold. He did not fold. Sibi George sat in that hotel room in Oslo, cameras rolling, hostile room, journalist who had already written her story, and he gave her history, he gave her numbers, he gave her philosophy, he gave her a constitution, he gave her vaccines sent to 150 countries. He gave her the G20 Delhi Declaration. He gave her the African Union at the world's most powerful economic table. He gave her Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, calm, dignified, unshakable. And then, just days before that, Dr. S. Jaishankar was sitting at Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi, chairing the BRICS foreign ministers meeting, hosting the foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other nations, and telling the world plainly, unilateral sanctions are unjustifiable. Cross-border terrorism must face zero tolerance, and the agenda of global affairs can no longer be set by a few and simply observed by the rest. Two different rooms, two different men, one country, one voice. This is the leadership India has right now, and it deserves to be said clearly, from Jaishankar reshaping India's place in the global order, to Sibi George defending India's dignity in a hotel press conference in Oslo. India is being represented with a caliber of confidence and intelligence that is rare. That is not something to take for granted, because the world does not give India respect automatically. The press freedom rankings will keep coming. The NGO reports will keep coming. The journalists with gotcha questions will keep coming. That is the world India operates in. But India keeps answering. Not with anger, not with apology. With 5,000 years of civilization, the legitimacy of the world's largest democracy, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a country that knows exactly who it is and where it is going. That is the India that showed up in Oslo. That is the India that showed up at Bharat Mandapam. And that is the India that will keep showing up in every room, at every table, on every stage, for as long as it takes the world to understand. The answer has always been the same. It will always be the same. We are India, and we are just getting started. Before wrapping up, there is a question for everyone watching this right now, because this video has covered two moments: Sibi George in Oslo, Jaishankar at the BRICS foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi. Moments where India's leadership stood tall and did not blink. But there are so many more of those moments. Moments that did not go viral. Moments that did not trend. Moments that maybe only some of you caught, and they stopped you in your tracks. So here is the question. What is that one moment for you? That one incident could be Jaishankar shutting down a Western journalist, could be an Indian diplomat holding their ground at the United Nations, could be a speech, a reply, a press conference, where India's leadership made you genuinely proud, where the response was so sharp, so composed, so perfectly delivered that it stunned you. That one moment that stuck with you, drop it in the comments, because these stories deserve to be told, and this community deserves to hear them. And while you are down there, what are your thoughts on what happened in Norway? On the audacity of those questions? On how Sibi George handled it? On whether India is doing enough of this on the world stage? The comments are open. This is the conversation worth having.